preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
The fifth and concluding lecture in this series on value judgments or ultimate values. Dr. Kolodny, the educational director here, had speaking about this last year, had said he's always been concerned personally with the question of what are areas in which one can make some sort of ultimate commitments. And I told him I thought it was a rather offbeat and difficult topic for the why. But he felt that it was worth the risk, particularly if we could focus on areas of human experience like the involvement with the historical area with which we began, which has been so prominent in Marxism, or the reevaluation of the religious source of values, which was our second lecture, or concern with art as a dimension of ultimate commitment, which was our third lecture. And of course, particularly in our culture, which is so technologically oriented, if not scientifically oriented, the impact of science for the reconstruction or reinterpretation of values. And tonight, I come to the fifth and concluding lecture, which has to do, after all, with the philosophy or with the assessment of value judgments. And this is a little more technical, and perhaps for that reason, not quite as directly relevant. And yet, being myself a philosopher, I would say that in some sense it's fundamental, in the sense that the question it raises are used in each of the other areas we spoke about. Let me put our problem tonight this way. Let us consider any one of the areas that we discussed in the past month. Let us assume that a person said, I am a Marxist. My ultimate value commitments are to the possibilities of a social reconstruction in a future historical age, the age of socialism. Or let's assume a person said, I am we'll make it a Jewish chassid. My ultimate value judgments have to do with my belief in the tradition as handed down from from God to Moses at Sinai, and it's interpreted through the chain of a rabbinical teaching. And so on and so forth. Any one of the four cases. In each case, there would be an obvious question. And what if the person disagrees with him? The anti-Marxist simply says, I think you're wrong, or your value judgments aren't true, or they're mistaken. Or what if the person disagrees with a chassid and says, I think you're wrong, justify it? And the question, what would arise given such disagreement, what would arise given such a conflict, is the question we have to ask ourselves tonight. And it's not a terribly profound original question. As a matter of fact, it's the most obvious question. We know that people have conflicting value judgments and they disagree. That's one reason why there are ideological wars. That's one reason why, I take it, man is the only animal in all of the biological species who kills. This isn't quite true, is it? But almost always true. The only animal who kills without any connection to motivation for food or survival. He kills for ideas, so to speak, or for justification or for commitment. He doesn't just kill because he needs food or direct physiological response, instinctive response. So that human beings do find themselves in conflicts of values. Certain types of wars, certain types of arguments reflect that. And also, of course, human beings continuously ask themselves, why should I believe this or do this rather than another? And at all those junctures, the question of justification arises. Now, if we turn to each of the areas we've discussed in turn, and obviously since this is sort of a review and final lecture, let's turn to them in turn, I think we will find great difficulty in the problem of justification. And let me refresh your memory. Our first illustration was, does history allow for ultimate value commitments, ultimate meanings? And simplifying and abridging what I said at that time, there are essentially two types of historical answers that are of great concern. One is the historicist or the traditionalist answer. And he says that history, through a tradition or through the organic growth of historical events, allows for ultimate values to be found in the processes of history. An Englishman like Burke could speak about the great bond of history from generations past to our current generation to generations yet unborn. And we can see that people have always found in historical traditions ultimate values. But if we immediately ask the question, what about a person who would disagree with that? What about a person who would say, what are you talking about? And Burke would say, I'm talking about the fact that this and this value has lasted 1,000 years. And we'd say, well, what proposition are you saying? Are you saying that anything which has lasted 1,000 years or 5,000 years is good? What if I deny it and I say, no, the new is good? How would you prove that you're right? And it immediately turns, I think that Burke would have great difficulty, because he would not want to maintain that any historical tradition, qua tradition, is right. That if anything has lasted 5,000 years, it's therefore good. There may be societies that have a tradition of cannibalism for thousands of years. There are headhunting societies that have a tradition of headhunting for thousands of years. Some of the American Indians had a tradition of war, being a tribe for hundreds and even thousands of years. Simply because it is a historical source, sometimes phrased and clothed in ritual, sometimes it gives people great meaning. When headhunting was abolished, the headhunters were devastated. Their society had lived in terms of hunting heads for religious ritualistic purposes, for purposes of ceremonial display, and so on. But one wouldn't want to say that every tradition, simply because it's existed as a tradition, is good. And the moment you deny that, the moment you say, yes, it's not just every tradition that's good, it's some are good and some are bad, then the immediate response is, by what criterion are some good and some bad? And the answer can't be because they are historical, because you've already said that some historical things are bad. This sounds like a complicated argument. It's a very simple one. Look, each of you, I'm sure, in a different context of your personal life, thinking about whether you would obey a certain ritual or certain tradition, have gone through this argument. Our first lecture was on whether historical materials, historical institutions, offer ultimate meanings. And one type of answer of this sort is the great conservative traditionalist answer, that in the growth of institutions and in their long development, there is sufficient proof of their value. Sometimes in Jewish sources, in Judah Levi, for example, there's an argument that the great age, the great traditional chain of the Torah is proof of its value. But this argument I'm now suggesting is no good as an argument. That doesn't mean the Torah is no good or some of the institutions argued for are no good, but the argument fails. Why does the argument fail? Because the argument says the justification of an institution is its age or its continuity. And you simply have to turn around and say, do you justify every institution that has age and continuity? And you point to institutions, like I just tried to give illustrations, wars or headhunting, which have continuity and long, long age. And the person says, no, I don't justify them. I only justify some things that have age or continuity. And then you immediately say, you justify some and you don't justify others. It follows that there is some criterion, something measure which you're judging, independent of age and continuity, in terms of which you judge these things. You say this tradition is good and this tradition is bad. It's not then tradition just because it's a tradition which makes it good or bad. It's some independent criterion. What is that? Well, perhaps there are answers to be found. Perhaps the traditionalist then turns and says it's their religious source, or they can be proven scientifically, or they make men happy. But the point is, it's not the historical tradition itself. And therefore, pressed with the issue of justification, particularly if there's a conflict, particularly if somebody says, I disagree, then the historical justification fails. And exactly the same is true if you move the justification as the revolutionary does, not from tradition, it's very, very old, but to the future. He will say, the future is good. And therefore, there are values in the reconstruction, revolutionary change in the future which are justified. Let me explain very simply. Assume a person says, and you have to think back of a Marxist, let's say of the 1930s, or contemporary Marxists, if there are any around who hold Marxism in exactly this way, that in the development of society, the future is always built upon the correction of the conflicts of the past. So that every new institution is somehow a growth in awareness built in upon the past. Just as a human being in development, somehow his next stage sometimes is a growth or a correction or a resolution of the conflicts of a previous stage. And if you therefore say to a person, what justifies this goal, he will say, it's the path to the future. It's the path to the future. A very famous remark in this case is always Lincoln Steffens visiting Russia after the revolution and saying, what was his sentence? I have seen the future and it works. And the whole point is, the justification is that it is the future. That it's the justification for a particular person who's in the avant-garde, which means the vanguard of the future, is that he is bringing about the future. And if you say, well, why bring about the future? Why not fight to restore the past? Why not keep the status quo? Somehow the argument is, but the future, simply because it's a resolution of the problems implicit in the past, is better. See, in the Marxist or Hegelian argument, history was based upon conflict, either class conflict or dialectical conflict, and the future was always the resolution or the synthesis of this conflict. Therefore, if a person were helping to bring about the future, he would be helping to bring about a better world, a source of values, and therefore there's a justification, historical justification, by turning and saying, I'm helping to bring about the future. Again, a very simple test. What if this is challenged? What if a man says, I'm a reactionary. I want to go back to the way things were. It was better then. I'm a reactionary. You say to him, you're a reactionary, you're blocking the future. That's bad. He says, I'm blocking the future. That's good. The future is going to be a nightmare. Now, how do you follow the argument here? You could simply sort of beg the question. You assume, but look, the future has to be better because it's the resolution of the conflicts in the present. Therefore, if you're blocking the future, you're making it worse. And the man says, no, the future is going to be worse because the resolution of the current conflict is going to result in these and these and these, in this and this and this situation, which I judge to be worse. I want to restore the past or hold on to the status quo. I'm a reactionary, and reaction is better than progress. Faced with this sort of conflict, it seems to me the revolutionary cannot just say the future is better because it's the future. Because there are many, many cases, there are certain futures which have occurred which he might well say is worse. You would want to say, look, do you want to say if death is the end of my life, and it's the end of everyone's life, that death is the future, that death is therefore better? And he would say, no, there are some kinds of future that are better, some kinds of future that are worse. Would you want to say that if Nazism follows capitalism, that Nazism is therefore better? And of course the Marxists said, well, it'll only be a temporary stage that's worse, and then socialism will come, but still some future things were worse. And they would themselves recognize that Nazism coming after capitalism is worse than the previous age, and that there have been some stages where the next stage is worse than the previous stage. Sometimes in life, the next year is worse than the present year, and you'd want to somehow, if you could, hold back the past. To that extent, you cannot say every future simply because it's a future is better. That's just like saying the coming might is right. Whatever will win in the future is right. But the fact that it will win or will be the future doesn't make it better or right. And then, faced with this conflict, it seems to me the Marxist or the revolutionary says, the future is better because of the following reasons. The Marxist will say, because it will lead to greater equality. Or he will say, because it will lead to less alienation. Or he might say, because there will be greater productivity. But then, notice, his argument is not that the future is better because it's the future, but the future is better because of these other values, and therefore the justification in terms of history fails. A new criterion, independent of history, has to be brought in. Now, if you followed the outline of this argument, what I did was exactly parallel. I gave the case of the justification of history, and I could just draw the diagram for you on the board to make it simple. My first step, if you just think a moment, I'll just repeat it. My first step was to say, let's assume a man said, tradition is good. My next step was to say, what if somebody contradicted him and said tradition is bad? What would the first person say? The first person wouldn't say every tradition is good, I think, because you would then point out some traditions which he would himself consider bad. Then my next step was to say, if that's the case, there's some criterion independent of tradition which he uses to justify good or bad. Therefore, this is the conclusion, the justification in terms of tradition alone fails. Then I did exactly the same argument for the future. A man justifies a certain policy because it brings about the future. I then said, second step, what if someone contradicts him and says the future will be worse? I then said, it seems to me the person never says the future is always better, every future is better simply because it's the future. He says some futures are going to be better, others are going to be worse. But then, this is the conclusion, his justification is not in terms of history or the coming future, but he appeals to some other criterion independent of the historical process for justification. So, on this issue of justification of value judgments, which is a very, very difficult issue, perhaps the most difficult issue in current philosophy, not just in our context, if we say history offers a justification, whether it's the historical past or the historical future, or for that matter the historical present, I think the argument always fails, and fails internally. The person making the argument himself would not want to abide by its consequences. Let me turn to the second type of justification. And this is going to be, if it's been difficult, and it shouldn't be difficult, the ideas and the points I'm making are very, very simple. The difficulty may be that I cannot succeed. Perhaps I should need a blackboard and repetition. I don't want to go into that sort of pedagogy, in making it simply as lucid and clear and as simple, very simple as I myself believe this part of the issue is. There are maybe difficult issues, but these aren't they. Let's turn to the second of the four topics we've discussed so far from the point of view of justification. And this again will be a repetition. I started to say that if some parts of this seem difficult, simply the repetition of the pattern of argument should make it easier. Let us consider a religious ethic. This is a case where a person says his value judgment, meaning by that his beliefs as to what ought to be the case, or what is good or what is bad, are derived from religious premises, either by revelation or by argument. He can say, I believe in the fatherhood of God, and all men are made in the image of God, and therefore certain things about their innate equality, which is an argument, not a revelation. And he can try to justify his value judgments from an argument beginning, let's say, this is a classic one, the fatherhood of God, the spiritual brotherhood of man, therefore the equality of man, therefore they ought to be treated equally. Or from revelation, God told man, these are the commandments, it's up to us to interpret them. Or from other sorts of religious arguments. Now, this is a very well-known source of ultimate value judgments, and all sorts of great moral commitments and great moral values have been lived, not just preached, but lived in human society historically on the basis of either religious arguments, religious premises, or religious institutions, or religious commands. But, same sort of difficulty. What if pressed? What if challenged? What if negated or contradicted? What if a person says, I disagree with this? What's the justification? Any one of the arguments I gave. What if the person says, the revelation is I disagree with the ethical implications of the revealed law, or with the logical argument that is given? It seems to me there's always difficulty here of two sorts. Difficulty number one is the religious premise, and you see the moral argument here is to have a moral conclusion. Let's say you ought to treat people equally from a religious premise. Say the argument always is God, the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man, and therefore there's a moral conclusion. Therefore you ought to treat men as brothers. Or there's a fact of revelation, therefore certain moral commands follow from it. Now, there are two parts then, the religious premise and the moral conclusion. And the first point is, of course, that it's notoriously difficult when challenged to establish the religious premise. If a person says, what's the justification of the religious premise? As we saw in our lecture, almost always the argument falls back upon faith or arbitrariness. There's no sort of ultimate justification. No way I think of ultimately proving the religious premise to the person who disagrees with it. And to that extent, most religionists agree on this, to that extent, if there's a question of justification, man has said, justify to me your value judgments. The great difficulty becomes is, do you accept the religious premise? And the man might very well say, no, justify the religious premise. And the person might say, it's impossible if justification requires an act of faith. And therefore, faced with conflicting opinions, the argument for justification fails because the religious premise is incapable of justification by a publicly agreed method. But let's assume, and this is the stronger point, that was point one, that the religious premise is incapable of being established. But now the stronger point, let's assume the person says, I grant the premise. I grant the premise. I'll grant any religious premise you want. You want the fatherhood of God and the spiritual brotherhood of men? I grant that. You name it and I'll grant it. It's taken for granted. The premises are granted. I just refuse to say that the conclusion follows. What do you want me to say? Say all men are brothers, all fatherhood of God and all men are brothers. You say that's very, very right. And how do brothers treat brothers? Well, Cain killed Abel. Well, big brother should look after and kill little brother and so on. You say, why does that follow? You say, why does the opposite follow? You say, but men should treat each other like brothers. Yes, well, all right. Well, what's sibling rivalry is a fact of life. Brothers always fight, or whatever illustration you want. The point is you say, but it doesn't follow that because it is the case that men are spiritual or brothers, that they ought to treat each other like brothers who fight. Why oughtn't they to treat each other like brothers who have brotherly love? And your answer is, well, perhaps they ought to the other way. Exactly the argument. It doesn't follow that because you say something is this way, it ought to be that way. It doesn't follow because you say God is the father and men are the brothers that you ought to treat them equally, just as it doesn't follow that you ought to treat them unequally. You see, this argument can be interpreted any number of ways. You can say God is the father and all men are brothers. Therefore, the king, who is the representative of God on earth, this was the famous argument, should look after men paternally with divine right. The same argument was used by the Democrats. God is the father, all men are brothers, therefore no man should be king over any other man. The same argument could be used by the anarchists. God is the father, men are brothers, therefore men should bow down to nobody but God, therefore there should be no society, no police, no president, only God is the king over all of us. The argument could justify anarchy, can justify democracy, can justify monarchy, can justify dictatorship. God is the father, men are his sons. In every society, this is the model. You need a strong father who commands. This is why you need dictatorship. And think of the model of God as sometimes fairly harsh dictator. Down the line, whichever one you want. And it isn't just a question of picking metaphors. Brothers fight or brothers have love. God is a father who's a tyrant, or God is a father who's benevolent despot, or God is a father and only God can be worshipped. It's a question of logic in the extreme sense that from the religious premise, which is a statement of what is the case, it doesn't follow what ought to be the case. This is the logic underlying it. A person says to me, it's warm in here. Or let me put it the other way, it's cool in here. You ought to put on heat. And I say, no, on the contrary, if they're cool, they'll stay awake more. So let them suffer, let them even catch colds, but let them be awake. Somebody else says, it's cool in here. You must make it warm quickly. They might fall asleep. It's too bad, but you must not maybe be sure of avoiding cold. Which you do doesn't depend upon the fact that it's cool in here. It depends upon what your value judgments are. But then you cannot look to the statement of what is the case to justify the value judgment. You need some independent criterion other than what is the case. Let me illustrate. A man says, put it any way you want. There is a God, and he has made all men in the image of God. And you there say, yes, and therefore it's terribly important for those of us who are closer to the image of God to begin to teach those other men who are further how to manage their lives. And you have an argument for despotism. Somebody else says there's a God and all men are made in the image of God, and therefore no man can take responsibility for fellow men, and you have an argument for freedom. It doesn't follow from what is the case, even if you grant it is the case, what ought to be the case. Let me give I did give this illustration, didn't I think, in discussing this the first time. The illustration of somebody yells fire in the school, and then does it follow that you ought to put it out? And of course, for some students, it's the very opposite. The school's on fire. You can see the joy. Let it burn. That's the old yeshiva joke, isn't it? The man who says, it's a true story at one of the fundraising events for one of the yeshivas uptown. The little children are the lights of this world. You can translate it from Yiddish yourself or back into Yiddish itself. Kinderen zijn die lichtelijke Welt. Long may they burn, lang zullen zij brennen. And you can, of course, see, long may they burn. The little children are the lights of this world. Long may they burn. You can see but you could say, the school building's on fire, it ought to be put out. The school's on fire, it ought not to be put out. It depends whether your concern or your value is preservation of property, or whether your value is collecting insurance, or all other considerations which might arise. And the same argument applies to the religious premise, which is a statement of fact, vis-a-vis the ought premise. It's a statement of transcendental or theological fact, but ought judgments do not follow from is judgments. And therefore, if a person says, and since God exists in this way, people ought to behave this way, there is some additional independent judgment which is necessary. From the existence of God, you could derive human sacrifice to God. You can derive the abolition of human sacrifice. It depends upon something else. And therefore, the religious justification by itself fails. You need some sort of additional premise. And this is exactly the same argument that we gave in the historical argument. We began with a man who said, I derived my value judgments from my religious belief. Then a person disagreed with him and said, I disagree with those value judgments. Then the person would be forced to say, even if you granted his religious premise, that from those religious premises, different value judgments could be derived. And it would depend upon some independent criterion which ones he pursued. The situation is even more direct in the case of artistic sources for value judgments. Because here, although we're involved in an area which has probably given people greater sense of values than almost any other historically, very, very few people have felt that what is necessarily aesthetically excellent or aesthetically wonderful is also necessarily morally wonderful. Indeed, sometimes they felt the very opposite, and we explored that. And therefore, the recognition that the beautiful is not necessarily the good, or that the good is not necessarily the beautiful, right away raises the question of justification. If a man is told, justify your value judgments in aesthetics, and the justification means give the moral justification, which is what we're concerned with, he can't just say, it's beautiful, therefore it's good, because he's painfully aware that there have been beautiful things of ultimate and transcendent aesthetic excellence which have not necessarily been good. One can think of indeed, very, very often, the conflict between what we consider morally desirable, what we consider aesthetically wonderful, is ingrained. If the great achievements of art and sculpture in Greece were built upon, in some of the cities, 80% of the population being slaves, so as to create the leisure class which could achieve this. This is a sort of dramatic recognition of the conflict between the morally desirable and the aesthetically excellent. So that very, very few people who would claim ultimate values of some sort in aesthetics would claim that they could give a moral justification of these aesthetic values, firstly. And secondly, even if they could, even if they said, but I can show that this is beautiful and therefore it's good and the greatest sort of expression of human excellence, it is notorious, isn't it? What if somebody disagrees with them and says, I don't think it's beautiful, I think it's ugly, or I think it's an aberration of human excellence? What if there is a disagreement? It's notorious that aesthetics is one of the areas, we'll come back to this in a moment, but just in a sort of common sense way. It's notorious that aesthetics is one of the areas where human beings disagree. This catchphrase, de gustibus non disputanum est, of taste there is no disputing. It's almost a cliche, and it's overdone, I'm sure, as I want to say in a moment, but still contains its truth. If a person says, I think it's of great aesthetic excellence, somebody else says, I think it's lousy, we know that it's very, very difficult and almost impossible to give justification. Usually one doesn't argue. If taste, there's no dispute. You say, you don't know anything about it, or it's not my cup of tea, or come back. You don't really feel that you have a technique of justifying or of proving it. I don't know anyone who would feel, I know very, very few people who would feel there is a sort of logical or rational technique of proving aesthetic excellence to a person who denied it, who said, I don't see it there. Situation is sort of, Hamlet sees the ghost, and Gertrude, his mother, says, I see it not, but all there is I see. How can you prove to her that she isn't seeing all that's there? A person looks at abstract expressionist painting and says, I see it, but there's nothing there. And you say, you're not seeing all that's there. You say, well, all that's there is there. How do you prove it? It's notorious in aesthetics that there's no technique of justification in such conflict. Though I think it's overstated, as I said a moment ago, but still, if there is such a conflict, I can think of no technique that's logical or rational by which one could somehow demonstrate that this is better. And to that extent, the possibility of a justification which would have some sort of logical conviction or rational proof behind it seems to fail. So let's see what I've said so far. Please notice in every case what I did. I took the historical justification, whether in past history or in future history, and I immediately put an antagonist, a person who disagreed. Somebody says, let's take the future case, socialism is good because it's the way of the future, the wave of the future. Somebody immediately says, socialism is awful. Will the person simply want to say every future thing is good, or only some future things are good? The moment he says some future things are good, he appeals to some criterion other than the future. How do you justify that criterion? Religious ethics. Somebody says God exists and therefore these things are good. Somebody else could say God exists but other things are good. Contradict the values. How do you prove them? You cannot prove them simply by appeal to religious premise, since from the religious premise contradictory values are derived. Some other criterion is necessary. But how do you justify that criterion? Aesthetic premise. Somebody says something is good because it's beautiful. Somebody says, all right. He could say, firstly, it's beautiful, but it isn't good. But let's assume he says it's beautiful, it's good because it's beautiful. But then he says, I disagree that this is beautiful, it's lousy. How are you possible to demonstrate in such cases of disagreement over taste? Finally, of course, fourthly, scientific judgment. Somebody says, here I can prove to you in some sort of scientific method that this is the best sort of value judgment. And the person says, how would you prove that? You say, well, I'll prove to you that democracy is good. You say, what will you prove? He says, I'll prove to you that most people want democracy. You say, all right, well then what most people want isn't good. All you can prove is that most people want democracy. You can't therefore prove that it's good. Well, I'll prove to you that if you're consistent among your preferences, you will choose this and this thing. I'll prove to you if you're consistent among your preferences, you will choose to minimize pain. And the man says, well, all right, but I prefer to be inconsistent. When it comes to a question of of a certain sort, I prefer inconsistency. Let me give an illustration. I will prove to you that if you're consistent among your preferences, no man would ever martyr himself over eating pork. And yet there were Jews historically who were willing to go to death rather than eat pork. Say they're inconsistent among their preferences. I would say, very well then, we're inconsistent among some of our preferences, but we believe that this is of transcendental ultimate value, and we're willing to die for it. Can the scientist prove to him that he's wrong? Go and prove to him that since he's a biological man who wants to live, that since this is a conditioned response based upon accident of his birth and environment, he shouldn't let himself die for it. He would say, maybe you're right. If I were a rational, scientific man, I would not die on the question of eating pork. But I am a Jew of this and this sort, and I'm going to die for it. Can he prove to him that he's wrong? I don't think so. He might be able to prove to him that he's inconsistent with some of his other value judgments if he chooses to do it. But then the man would say, I prefer to be inconsistent and not eat pork and die than to be consistent and eat pork and live. And this is perfectly legitimate. Or a man could say, so the question here at issue is, if the person says I can prove value judgments scientifically or rationally, the response might well be, but why should I accept the implication? There are several sorts of response. Let me redo this in a moment. But the first sort of response is, why should I accept the values implicit in your scientific judgment? Let me give an illustration, another illustration before I formalize the point. I got ahead of myself a little bit perhaps in the illustration, but the illustration is a strong one. There have been people who have had ultimate value judgments which seem non-rational, which certainly could not be scientifically proven. And I gave an illustration which I think from the vantage point of most Jews seems one in which they have a certain ambivalence. Jews who were willing to die rather than eat meat that was treif. And yet it seems to me, although you couldn't prove that it's right to die rather than eat meat that was treif, you couldn't prove the religious justification, you couldn't disprove it. At most you could show is that the man was biologically not maximizing his happiness. But he would say, all right, I choose not to maximize happiness. Or you might say that he was acting on insufficient evidence. And he might say, all right, I choose to act on faith and on insufficient evidence. I don't know that you would give a disproof of his choice. This was the point I was making in the illustration. Let me give another illustration, somewhat harsher one, in the sense that it can be argued both ways, more difficult one, I mean, but still an interesting one. In the 16th and 17th century, 16th and 17th century, the whole point of view that man had about the dimensions of his world changed. He used to believe, not just as a question of faith, but as a fact of science and knowledge, that the world was the center of the universe, and that the earth was the center of the universe, and that the heavens were above it in certain spheres which could be counted, the planets about it in certain spheres which could be measured, in their motions. And this, of course, made man the central figure of the earth. And, of course, to this, though this wasn't part of the science, was a recognition of how hell was below and heaven was above. But the central point was that earth was the center of the universe, and man, therefore, the central figure in creation. Now, let us assume that what happened is, of course, first the discovery there are infinitely many worlds. Then the earth is not the center of the universe. It's just one tiny speck of a planet around one tiny speck of a medium-sized star in one medium-sized galaxy of such a huge number. And this changed man's whole image of himself, as of his importance, and so on. Now, what happened during this period to some people? They said, well, look, you've got to accept that the earth is not the center of the universe, because if you believe that the sun is the center of the universe, the science works out much simpler. Whereas if you make the earth the center of the universe, it's very complex. You can't get the same readings through the telescope that are effective, and so on. And what if a person answered this way? Now look, I have a very coherent story of man's role in the world. If I make man not the center of the universe, I'll have a very complex and confused theory of man's role in the world. I have a very complex and confused theory of the scientific solar system. It's true that if I make man the sun the center of it, I'll have a much simpler theory. So the question is, do I want to look through a telescope and have a simple theory of science, which will allow me to build space machines and so on, and a complex and confused theory of man, or do I want to have a simple theory of man and his centrality and his dignity, not look through telescopes, and have a confused picture of the solar system? And a person might well say, I choose, as a matter of values, to ignore science and to have a complex and confused picture of the solar system, to refuse to look through the telescope, and to have a simple and simplistic, coherent picture of man. He might choose that. And what would the scientist say to him? He say, but if you would look through the telescope, you would see that the motions are such that the Earth can't be the center. He says, I refuse to look. But then you're blocking the road to inquiry. He says, well, so what? I'm keeping a central vision of man. But your faith will be based on cowardice. He says, yes, it'll be based on prudence or cowardice or failure to press facts to their utmost. So what? But won't you have the lingering suspicion? He says, I'll be able to block it out. I'll be able to block it out. Especially if I get rid of the people who do want to look through telescopes and have this morbid curiosity to somehow delimit man. But you have such a terribly complex astronomy there, all these little cycles to keep the Earth in the center. Well, so I'll have a complex astronomy. It's nothing so terrible. Say, but somehow you've abdicated truth. As well, truth is not my ultimate value. I have other ultimate values. But you say, well, but prove to me that I should be consistent or look through the telescope. It's one thing to say, once you've looked through the telescope, I'll prove to you that Earth is not the center of the universe. Prove to me that I ought to look through the telescope. Here the scientist says, oh no, I can't do that. What the scientist can say, I think, is, if you've looked through the telescope, the only coherent and rational argument is that the sun, not the Earth, is the center of the solar system, but that you ought to look through telescopes. This one cannot prove. This is a value judgment. It requires some justification other than science. But then we're back at our same difficulty. It requires some justification other than science. Where do you get that justification? So let's see what our difficulty is. Our difficulty in this case was, let's assume we have scientific demonstration of a value judgment, and a person disagrees with it. And he then says, I disagree with it. Then the person says, but if you accept scientific method, I can prove this value judgment to you. And the man then says, I refuse to accept scientific method. He says, but if you refuse to accept scientific method, you'll have to pay a certain price. You won't find out as much about the world. You won't be as consistent. The man says, I'm willing to pay that price. Why ought I not to pay that price? Scientist can't answer that. He needs some other criterion as to why you ought or ought not to pay that price. The moment there's some other criterion, then the justification of scientific method cannot be given by science. It has to be given by some other value. Let's say the belief that truth is important. But how do you justify that value? So in every case, it seems to me in every case, we ran into a dead end, didn't we? We took each one of these 5 that we've taken, and we saw from the point of view of justification that faced with a person who was willing down the line to argue against it, there was no way of convincing him or proving to him that he was wrong without presupposing some value judgment which itself required justification. What follows from this? Well, I suppose what follows from this would be, if it's correct, and now I'll just say what I think follows from this and develop that position, and then I'll spend about 5 minutes, and then I'll spend about 3 or 4 minutes on the backs and forths, and then since I promised last time to try to give you more than the 5 minutes, I'll throw the rest open for questions for the last 10 or 15 minutes. What follows from this sort of negative exercise, this recognition that although each week for the past month I have taken and tried to demonstrate and exhibit and explicate or show how there have been values in the domain of science, religion, art, and history which human beings have fought for, I have now tried to show tonight, in following the logic of value judgments, that faced with their denial or their negation, there is no way, other than by an appeal to some other criterion which itself requires justification, of demonstrating or proving them. Well, the answer, I suppose, would be that what follows from this is there is a sense in which our value judgments are arbitrary. They depend upon arbitrary commitment. They're arbitrary in the sense of they are incapable of proof. They are incapable of ultimate justification. They depend upon some sort of arbitrary commitment. And interesting enough, there's a reasonable consensus of philosophers, both extremes, who share this position, though I'm not sure that they are necessarily right. And let me just mention what those extremes are. The one extreme, the extreme philosophers of science, particularly of logical science, the position called logical positivism. Positivism because they believe in the positive sciences, logical because there was a previous movement led by a man named Auguste Comte called sociological positivism, which believed that history was going from religion to metaphysics to the positive sciences. And now in logical positivism, it's believed that knowledge or truth can only be demonstrated not, as was once believed, through religious truth or through philosophical truth, but only through scientific truth. Now this school says the real test is take any value judgment. Now let me be technical for a moment, but interesting enough, this technical procedure is simpler perhaps than my common sense. Let's be technical for a moment. Let's take a sentence which is a value judgment. This is a very simple thing. We'll pick a sentence that has 3 words, 3-word sentence. What's the popular song? 5 little letters, 3 little words, 5 little letters that say I love you or something like that. There's such a hit song. It can't be 5 letters. How many is it? 7, 9? Well, you can't count. 4, 7, 8 little letters. All right. 3-word sentence. Anything you want, democracy, peace, brotherly love, family, X, anything you want for the first word, is for the second word, and good for the third word, good or right. A is good, or A is right. That's the sort of ideal value judgment sentence. That's really what we're worried about. People say these things. Something is good. Democracy is good. Killing is not good or is bad. Murder is wrong. Something else is right. Justice is right. All right. We want any sentence of that sort, 3-word sentence ending is right or is wrong for the thing, is good or is bad. And then the question at issue is, can you show that such a sentence is true? Is true. That's all. That's really what we're asking. Can you prove that such a sentence is true? And now Ayer says you can never do it. Why? Because you take all the sentences that there are millions of sentences in the world, millions and millions of words, as the Kohelet says, making many books, there is no end. But he says all of those sentences will either be sentences, when you prove them true, it's because you've done logic or mathematics. It's like saying 2 and 2 is 4, 2 and 2 is 5. You can prove them true. Or there will be sentences which you can prove them true by giving scientific evidence. This is a yellow sheet of paper. You can prove it true by looking at it. I might be mistaken. If so, you would have to prove it. I'm mistaken by checking the lights or checking my glasses or rechecking the color. Is it really yellow? Is it illusion due to the light? And so on. But you could prove it true that way. But assume that there's no way in logic and no way in sense experience of proving it true, then you cannot prove it true. It's like the sentence, let me give a sentence, hurrah for the Y. You can't say hurrah for the Y is true or hurrah for the Y is false. You can say the Y is on 92nd Street is true. Or you can say the Y is the first letter of the Y, the letter Y stands for the first letter of YMHA, but the Y is on 92nd Street is true. Or the Y has this in this program is true. Or is false. But you can't say hurrah for the Y is true, hurrah for the Y is false. And Ayer says, you see, scientific statements and mathematical statements are true or false. But value judgment statements aren't statements of science and aren't statements of mathematics. Therefore, they can never be true or false. They are, those of you who were here last year in the core lecture which I gave in this, they're emotive statements. They're statements like saying hurrah or boo. To that extent, go and prove to Mr. Castro that Castroism is bad. You can get him He was saying hurrah for Castro, you're saying boo for Castro. There might be scientific judgments. Castroism led to a decline in the sugar production in Cuba. Can be proven, true or false. Castroism led to domination of the Cuban economy by the Russians. Can be proven, true or false. Castroism led to greater economic independence from outside countries. Maybe true relative to the United States investments in Cuba, maybe false relative to the Soviet investments in Cuba. But somebody says, remember our sentence, Castroism is good, or Castroism is right. How would you prove that? For instance, it's true it led to many deaths, it's true it led to a debacle in the sugar prices, it's true it led to Soviet intervention, but it's good, it's right, hurrah for it. And there is no way Ayer would say of demonstrating this, because it's not a question of logic or a question of science. So interestingly enough, the extreme scientist school argues that value judgments are therefore ultimate arbitrary commitments on the one hand. And of course, the extremely anti-scientific school, the existentialist school, which is opposed to scientific method in the sense that it believes that the domain of being is incapable of determinism and of explanation by law, argues also that man's value judgments are his arbitrary commitments. Sartre, for example, always maintained a person's value judgment is what he is willing to affirm arbitrarily. If he can prove it, it ceases to be his ultimate value, and therefore value judgments in the nature of the case can never be rationally proven. They must always be ultimate arbitrary existential commitments. So there is an interesting consensus which I think grows out of the failure, of our failure when we went through each of the areas to show demonstrations or techniques for proving value judgments. And the result is, of course, whether from the core of scientific method, the belief that value judgments, which statements that something is good or bad, right or wrong, since they're outside science, can never be proven, are therefore neither true or false, and therefore ultimately arbitrary. And of course, non-scientific positions, which argue that man, since he is free to create his own future, since he's not totally determined, therefore creates his values in an ultimately arbitrary fashion. So we have in contemporary philosophy two positions at the opposite poles of thought, positivism and existentialism, both of which maintain the impossibility of demonstrating value judgments. Now, what should one say in terms of my own comments in conclusion with back and forth? What have I done? It may seem terribly disappointing. Perhaps it is, perhaps it isn't. I've tried to show how, though there are obvious areas of ultimate value or meaning in each of the domains we've spoken about, none of them has an ultimate justification of its value commitments independent of some other criterion. And then I've said the conclusion from this negative position, something where there's agreement on the opposite poles of contemporary philosophy, is that value judgments are ultimately arbitrary. What now should I say? Well, I think that the conclusion that value judgments are ultimately arbitrary in itself wouldn't be necessarily fatal to ethical living. I think I should say that. I have a story here which I told last year, and I told in different contexts. I may even have told it this year, so I don't want to repeat too much. But A.J. Ayer, I'll repeat it anyhow. A.J. Ayer, and if you've heard it before, you'll just have to bear with me. A.J. Ayer, who's the most prominent logical positivist, was invited when was in this country to lecture before a White House seminar that President Kennedy's advisors ran. And the late President Kennedy was not there, but most of the cabinet was. And Ayer presented the views of the position logical positivism. And one of the philosophers at Columbia, seeing him just before then, said to him, "Are you really going to," this was right after the missile crisis. This was around Christmas time, and the missile crisis was when? October. So this was like December after October. He said, "Are you really going to tell," or rather, pardon me, he'd already spoken that second time when he asked him, "Did you really tell the Cabinet of the United States that whether something is good or bad or right or wrong is arbitrary, and it's an ultimate arbitrary commitment and can't be proven? Did you really tell them that Castroism is bad, is arbitrary?" And Ayer said, "Yes, I did. I said to them that since these value judgments are arbitrary, and the person rubbed it in because they heard one said, it's just like saying, boo for Castro, you're not on our team. Did you really tell this? And I said, yes, I did. I told them that since value judgments are ultimate arbitrary commitments, since they cannot be proven, they must therefore be very, very careful in examining their own ultimate commitments, re-examine them as cautiously as they can before they act on this. He said, what was the reaction? And there very proudly listed the people who were there, Dillon, McNamara, and so on and so forth, Gilpatrick. He said the reaction was very, very good. They were willing to accept as a commitment for moral living the recognition that ultimately one cannot prove one's value judgments. By the way, just apropos of this, I noticed in today's paper that starts coming to this country, there was some talks a long time ago of his coming to lecture at the Y. I know he's coming to give 6 at Cornell. I don't know whether the lectures at the Y had worked out. Technically, since he's been on so many communist fronts and so on, it's a violation of the Karen Act, but I guess they went around it to let him come. The first point, but this, if it starts, of course, the most famous person, I think, much more famous than Eyre, for arguing for the ultimate arbitrariness of value judgments. I don't think it's necessarily fatal to making value judgments to recognize that they are ultimately arbitrary, that they're not true or false. A person says, no, I can't really prove my value judgments the way I can prove my mathematical judgments or my scientific judgments. Well, then I have to be very cautious in making them, but all the same I do make them, but I don't make them as issues which are true or false. I make them as issues which I am saying hurrah for or standing for, not as issues which I can prove. On the other hand, just to give the back and forth, there are many people who feel if you cannot prove your value judgment, if you can't prove that thou shalt not kill is true and thou shalt kill is false, if you can't prove to the Nazi or prove to the rational man that the Nazi is wrong, then somehow you lose the basis for action. And it's this back and forth on value judgments which we are concerned with. Now, I myself, I'm not so sure that Eyre and Sartre and the negative thesis I developed throughout the first, 50 minutes tonight, should have the last word. Look, I'll say only, I really have 5-6 points, but I'll make them very quickly and skip 1 or 2 as I go along. The first point is, it seems to me that very often when somebody says something is good and somebody else says something is bad, we think they are disagreeing in attitude. We think they're disagreeing. One is saying hurrah for something, one is saying boo for something. But very, very often they may be disagreeing in facts. And if that's the case, the issue could be resolved by knowing more facts. Very, very often somebody says, I am for a minimum wage of $1.50. Somebody else says, I'm for a minimum wage of $1. You might say they're really disagreeing in attitude. One's saying hurrah for the worker, the other's saying hurrah for the employer. And that might be the case. On the other hand, it might be the case you say they're disagreeing in interest. One runs a car wash factory, he needs cheap labor. The other one is a worker, he wants more wages. It's a disagreement in interest. Perhaps if the worker became the employer or vice versa, they would change their minds. But it's not a disagreement that can be scientifically resolved. But very often, even this sort of disagreement hinges upon disagreement in fact. It's scientific disagreement. Meaning by that, if you really could show to the man who makes policy that if you were to raise the minimum wage, for example, it would be at the risk of increasing unemployment. If you raise the minimum wage, it would be at the risk of driving industry out of the state. People who are for higher minimum wages would change their mind on the basis of evidence. And vice versa. If you could really show the person who is for a lower wage that if he increased the wages, he would have better customers for his product and his profitability would go up, he would change his mind too. And very often the disagreement, which seems to be one is saying hurrah and the other is saying boo, is a hidden disagreement of fact which could be resolved by scientific method. I'm not saying all judgments are that kind, where a person says something is good and something is bad, but I'm not sure that a great many aren't that way. A man says, I'm for communism. And if he really, are there slave labor camps? And if he really believes that there were, he might very well change his mind. So one of the disagreement is he says, and there aren't any slave labor camps. But if there were, I wouldn't be for communism. In which case the disagreement really isn't just one man is saying hurrah for communism, one is saying boo for communism, go argue with him. It's a disagreement in fact. He believes that if there's communism, there aren't any slave labor camps. If you could take him to Karaganda and show him the slave labor camps, he would say, I am no longer a communist. In that sense, it's a disagreement in fact, just as much as a man says, any issue of fact, I believe that cancer is caused by a virus, and you show that there are non-viral cancers, and he changes his mind. So value judgments sometimes, which seem to be disagreements of ultimate arbitrary attitude, hinge upon facts. This is the first point. Let me, as I said, I had 5. Let me just make 2 more very briefly. I said, for example, that value judgments may be ultimately arbitrary. And yet, following from this, isn't it the case? And I gave as an illustration of judgments where it seems to me people really can't argue. They say there's no use quarreling about tastes, aesthetic judgments. Someone says, you're for that, I'm for the opposite. You think it's beautiful, I think it's lousy. That's often even more extreme than you think it's good and I think it's bad. And now I just want to put one question to you. Isn't it notoriously true that people's value judgments converge, even in questions of aesthetics? Let's take the man who says, look, you can't argue issues of ultimate value judgments. You like it, I dislike it. What's there to argue? And I would turn to him and I would say, tell me, do you believe that a Sidorsky, that's my name, is as good as a Rembrandt? Well, what if I were to say to you, Sidorsky is as good as a Rembrandt? Would you say, well, you can't argue value judgments? You'd say, you're right. And you believe a Rembrandt's better? Yes, you're right. And you'd say, well, you see, for Sidorsky, Sidorsky's better than Rembrandt. For most people, Rembrandt's better than Sidorsky. It was just a question. The majority can be wrong and Sidorsky can be right, or vice versa. I might say, you're fooling. You don't really believe that a moment. Come off it. You don't believe that for a moment. If I were to say it, you'd say, I'm crazy. I believe that I paint better than Rembrandt. Or you'd say, there's something wrong. I say, why should that be the case if it's just ultimate arbitrariness? But lo and behold, you say, because anybody who learns about painting, anybody who has eyes, sees that Rembrandt is better than Sidorsky. Well, if that's the case for the extreme cases, I use this in my introductory philosophy classes, and I sometimes get the students to really say, oh no, it's ultimately arbitrary. It just depends on what your taste is. And if you really like a Sidorsky better than a Rembrandt, and sometimes my little boy's scribbles when he was in kindergarten said to me, these are wonderful. If you really like it, it's better. And I'd say, you mean to say if I were to say the painting my little boy did is better than Rembrandt, you'd say, that's as true as the other? And the students say, yes, that's right. And I say, you can't possibly be serious. The absurdities which people will get into defend a position. Because surely if there's ever a reductio ad absurdum, a reduction to an absurdity of a position, that's it, that a painting by a 5-year-old boy said by the father of that boy to be as good as a Rembrandt is as good as a Rembrandt. There is never a more ludicrous argument. And therefore, ultimate arbitrariness, even in aesthetic judgments, doesn't seem to me to be the case. And even stronger than that, we know that although it's notorious that one century likes one type of painting, another century the opposite, that there has been convergence in value judgments. That most people who study English literature decide that Shakespeare ranks very, very highly. And if there's convergence on questions of taste, and I think this is true for very obvious questions. It's notorious, one person likes, you ladies will know, who are here will know more about this than me, one person likes spangled dresses, another person likes plain dresses. But I think almost everybody, for the most vulgar taste, if they begin studying it and go after it, if they become to some extent a connoisseur, lo and behold, they'll say the best suits are made by, and they'll mention only 4 or 5 people, Chanel or Mambochet or Norman Norell and so on. Why should this be the case if it's ultimately arbitrary? Apparently it's possible for human beings who have roughly the same span of intelligence, roughly the same span of needs, to converge in their judgments. If this is true on such extremely arbitrary questions as painting and clothes and hats, where was there more an element of taste where it's your judgment, you think it's wild, I think it's good, and yet you'll get convergence. Hattie Carnegie's hats or so-and-so's hats are the best hats, that's true. It's not just a question of what you like or what you choose. There's better taste and worse taste. If you get convergence there, then why shouldn't one get convergence in values? For people who are consistent, for people who are willing to look at consequences, for people who are mediumly rational, Nazism is something which they would all reject if they've had experience with it, including the Nazis. Is it possible to get convergence here? Why should it be more arbitrary than hats or paintings? Hats or paintings are arbitrary? Value judgments? Well, but there is convergence. The second point is, the third and final point, I said this first point is disagreements of value are often disagreements of fact. The second point was this fact of convergence, that people come to agree on the most arbitrary and remote questions if they are willing to be open-minded. And this raises the sort of third ultimate conclusion. Everyone would agree that there's some sense in which everything is arbitrary. Everything is arbitrary. A man says 2 and 2 is 5. If he simply wants to say it, you can't prove to him he's wrong. How would you prove to him? He just refuses to talk. But if we assume some degree of consistency, if we assume some degree of openness to evidence, if we assume some degree of common needs, then the question is, isn't it possible, given this, to arrive at value judgments that aren't totally arbitrary? You wouldn't prove that you shouldn't be, that you should have to be consistent. Yes, you'd have to somehow accept some degree of consistency. But it's like saying you accept that you're going to go on living. You'd have to prove that you accept some degree of openness to evidence. But again, this is like proving simply that you want to go on living. You have to prove that you'd have to depend upon certain similarity of human needs. But granted those 3 things, I wonder if it isn't the case that for almost all value judgments, perhaps for all the important ones, we could show that if people disagreed about them, but if they were willing to talk, to be rational, to follow evidence, we could find convergence. We could find an area of agreement. So that even the most extreme person from a different tradition would say, but if this is the consequence of my belief, I will change my belief in the light of this evidence with what I know about men and so on. The only argument you prove is, what if a person says, I refuse to talk, I refuse to have anything to do with it? Well, at that point, it is ultimately arbitrary. But at that point, discussion is broken down. At that point, of course, one simply has to fight for one's values without being able to prove them to someone else. But this, I think, is sort of the last analysis in every human situation. You could never have a proof that wouldn't ask the question, what steps did you use in that proof? And you would need to give some other proof, and you would ask the question, how did you prove the steps that were in that proof? And so on and so forth. Here one does come to some degree of ultimate commitment, which is inevitable, but it doesn't just mean that value judgments are arbitrary. It's this point, perhaps, since it's very late, that was recognized in the old Jewish statement. You need something to begin with. You must begin with one of the 10 miracles created, 10 things created Friday night at sunset. You see, they're not in the 6 days of the Bible. So if there were 10 things created Friday night at sunset, is the forge from which the other forges were made. The first premise, which somehow has to, this is a legend in the Talmud, tzvat shebetzvat asuyah, the forge. In order to make a tool, you need a forge, or the forge from which the other forges were made. How do you get a forge? You need a previous forge. How do you get that? So somehow, to get started, we need some sort of commitment. And obviously, without that, there's nothing. But given that, we're not just left in the world saying, well, you like Nazism, I like fascism, I like Castroism, I like so-and-so. It seems to me there are possibilities for convergence and justification. But it only seems so, because no one has been able to perfectly satisfactorily demonstrate that. And indeed, that's part of the crisis of our time, I suppose. On the one hand, we have an age which has such great achievements, artistic achievements, scientific achievements preeminently, even perhaps only superficially, but at least superficially, religious achievements. Certainly achievements in historical and social action, and those are the 4 I spoke about: scientific, artistic, historical, and social action, and religious. And yet we have an age which on fundamental value questions is incapable of giving justification in any one of these domains. Although interestingly enough, as I've tried to suggest, the situation is what? Not hopeless. You know that old joke, Are things bad? Are things bad? How are things, what does it go? How are things in Berlin? It's from 1, 2, 3. They are hopeless. They are troublesome but not hopeless. And the fellow gets it wrong and says they are troublesome but not hopeless. He says they are hopeless but not too troublesome. It may be that this is the case with ultimate value judgments. We can go on living even though the logical situation may be close to hopeless. Well, I'm almost hopeless or incorrigible in the sense that I don't quite finish on time. But at any rate, if we're trying such a difficult thing as demonstration of ultimate value judgments, I hope you'll forgive me running over time. We still have some time for questions. Yes?
Can you show convergence of values for widely different societies?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the first.
Can you show convergence of values for widely different societies? You started with a headhunting society.
Yeah. Well, I guess the answer, that's an anthropological answer, would be the degree of communication between them, the degree of communication. Obviously, different societies and different milieus with no communication, developing different patterns of human nature. You can show some and not show others. It seems to me you can show certain common values in each of the society. Almost all of them will have some rules. They'll have some kinship rules and so on. On the other hand, you would say yes, but that really begs the question because the values of a headhunting society, the values of another society are so different. Well, all right. But what if there's a degree of communication between the two? Then I think you do get convergence to some extent on values, not always on the hierarchy which we might want. Let's take equality for women as a value. Do you get convergence for equality of women? It seems so. The women brought up in harem society and so on, experience to the opposite, begin to say we prefer a society. What about the men in such a culture? Well, perhaps they do too, though it's more complex. Yet you don't always get convergence on the values you want. I remember in Tangier seeing the women wearing veils, and I said to my wife, you see, how will you get convergence on the question of equality of women if they prefer that, and if that's the way of life they choose? And she says, well, you didn't notice that woman was chewing gum behind the veil. I didn't notice. And she had painted, she was wearing sandals, had painted toenails. And now you already see, I don't know whether you call this convergence or cultural commingling, but if a veiled woman is chewing gum and having painted toenails, the possibilities of spread of values and therefore reorientation of values are genuine. But I would put it this way. I think to the extent to which there is willingness to argue the issue on consequences, when there is conflict, you might very well get convergence. To the extent to which you don't get convergence, there are two answers. Answer number one is there's nothing wrong. They'll develop in one tradition, you develop in the other, and they won't conflict. Say, aha, but they do conflict, and yet you don't get convergence. At that point, it seems to me you would simply say, to the extent to which there is different human nature, with different human sorts of needs, to that extent, of course, you won't have universal value judgments. And if they will conflict, there is nothing that can be done about it. The situation then is like the mosquito conflicts with the man. There's nothing to be done. They will bite you and you will slap at them. But to the extent to which human nature has shared needs, communication is possible. I think there's possibility for intercultural convergence. The question would be how much proof could you give of it? Only limited proof. Other questions? Yes?
In the fourth case, for example, you gave, in the first start example, you said that the person believes in the future, and then the antagonist said, well, suppose the future is fascism, and the protagonist would say, well, I agree that that may not be as good. The second case, similarly, the protagonist may say, in the religious question, yes, it may not be best to be all brothers because Cain did kill Abel. And the third question, of course, the art value, the protagonist would say, you're right, it wasn't worth the Greek Empire. But in the fourth question, the protagonist never deviates. It's only the antagonist that doesn't agree with the value judgment. In other words, he made no dent in the belief.
Yes, but I don't think that each of the arguments is quite as parallel. You're paying me more compliment than I deserve. Each of the arguments is not quite as strictly parallel as you suggest now, and I didn't present them quite as elegantly parallel as you reconstruct them. But the fourth case, let's see what it is. The person who believes in scientific judgment argues, I wish to demonstrate the following value on the basis of science. And the antagonist then says, I disagree with this value. And my point is then the antagonist must pull back. He must say that there is some appeal other than to scientific method which is used in the justification of the value. Because actually here the person would say, I accept the scientific method totally, but I don't accept the value. I should take this case. Look, let me take a very concrete case. A man says, science has proven that the Negroes and the whites are equal. Therefore, you're a racist. You have to abandon your position. And the man says, no, I believe the Negroes are genetically inferior. Therefore, I'm anti-Negro. I want these laws that are now coming before the Supreme Court, no intermarriage between Negro and white, to stand. The scientist then says, here is all the evidence. It absolutely demonstrates that they are genetically equal. Now, the man can then say, gee, I used to believe that there should be no miscegenation, no intermarriage of white and race, because I believe the Negroes are inferior. Now you've proved to me that they're equal genetically, therefore I'll change my mind. But instead he says, you know, it's true that they're genetically equal, but I'll tell you, they are, let's think up some other quality, they are more psychologically nubial, more psychologically beat or hip or some other term, and therefore I'm opposed to having people who are psychologically beat and hip mixing with people who are more sedate and middle class, and therefore I'm still opposed to it. And he says, no, you're wrong. And he makes a statistical psychological study, and he proves that the Negroes are more Christian and all in all, viewed all in all. It's just that you see the Negroes of this type in show business and so on. The Negro community as a whole is more middle class and stable than the white community. And the man says, gee, I used to have this prejudice, but the sociological evidence is against it. I now change my mind. But now what if no matter what the scientist proves, the man says, look, I accept all the science you want to give me in the world. Give me the science of biology, it'll prove that they are genetically equal. Give me the science of sociology, it'll prove that their family patterns are the same, let's say. Give me the science of psychology, it'll prove that their environmental capabilities are identical or superior, what have you. But I just don't like them, or don't want them, or are down with them. Then it's not qua scientist that the scientist can say to him, you ought to change your mind. In other words, the scientific demonstration of all the factual possibilities does not commit one to the attitude pro or con, which is derived from the science. Now, I may have not put this position, I did have it in my notes to develop later, I may not have put this position as precisely as one ought to, but the argument is that the scientific method in itself is incapable of demonstrating the value judgment because people who would accept the scientific method on all the factual questions would reject it on the value judgment. Now, your question may be right. You may say, no, they really can't. If the man really accepts all those facts, he couldn't somehow simultaneously have prejudice. But I wonder, a man could say, I agree with all the facts, I just have a different attitude. Please, yes.
That the believer in the first place, in the first three cases, backed down somewhat and said, yes, you're right in that case, of course, but in the scientific case, the scientist never backs down.
Well, he has to withdraw the claim, though. I agree with you on the backing down, but that's because, you see, in the other cases, each one claims that there are value judgments derived from religion, or from aesthetics, or from history. And in the scientific case, the person said, there are no value judgments derived from science, so he withdraws. But the same strategy, actually, if we looked at it, is possible for each of the other cases. The historian could say, I only know what the history will tell me, or what the history said. I can't tell you any values in it. Or the aesthetician could say, I only know what squeezes together, comes out as an interesting work. Don't talk to me about values. Or the religionist could say, I only know what God told me, whether it be good or bad. I should sacrifice my own son. I don't know whether it's good or bad, but that's the command of God. So the same withdrawal to indifference to values is possible in each of the cases. And the scientist has to withdraw in that case. The one leeway I leave open for the scientist myself is, this is my own prejudice, is, my own position here is, I'm not at all sure that if a person really agreed on all the beliefs, take the most prejudiced racist you can think of, if he really changed his mind on all the facts, if he really shared all the facts that the most liberal person you can think of had, could he still have a racist prejudice? It's hard to say. If Hitler believed all the facts about the Jews that a Jew believes, could he still say, I believe all these things, that's exactly why I hate them? Or would change of facts indirectly change attitudes, so the scientific judgment differs from the others? Yes?
This is not because it's scientific judgment. This is on a different level. When the other man tells you at the end of all your logic, no, I don't believe in it, it has nothing to do with science anymore. And then on something different starts.
Yes, this is what both Eyre and Sartre say, that at that point it's nothing to do with science, it has to do with attitude, or it has to do with emotive commitment, or it has to do with existential affirmation. At that point, science ends and commitment begins. But I can't divorce them quite as sharply. I've noticed your questions several times, and they're very good in this sense. You're right, and yet, that's sort of my attitude. You're right in the sense that, look, we know that there were people who were, J.B.S. Haldane was certainly one of the greatest scientists of the 20th century. And yet, when it came to questions of his communist belief, one couldn't argue with him the way one would argue about him in the biology. Certainly there were great Nazi scientists. Some, at any rate, there. I'm trying to think, is that historically true? I just take for granted that there were, but I assume that some of the people who worked on the projects in Germany who didn't leave Germany were eminent as scientists. And you say science ends and attitudinal commitment begins. And yet I'm not sure that one can so divorce facts from attitudes. The person who is prejudiced doesn't just say, I believe all these facts, but I'm prejudiced. He says, really, but you know that they are racially inferior or something. The person who says the Jews are inferior doesn't just say, I believe all these facts about the Jews, but I'm prejudiced. He says their heads are short and fat instead of long and narrow, or some other such thing. So I'm not sure that there isn't some very close connection between fact and attitude, which would say if a person agreed with me on all the facts, but he just has a different attitude, I'm puzzled by that. If he agrees on the facts, I think his attitude would shift. And although in one sense I agree with you, look, we know people who were very eminent on facts and then their attitudes vary. In another sense, I'm disagreeing with you. I'm saying, but look, what does it really mean if a person agreed on all the facts and said, but I have a different attitude toward it? Isn't the attitude closely related to facts? And if he really shared all the facts, could he share the attitude? It's a question. It's not something we can answer. Yes, I guess up here first and then.
But that is based on the irrational in man.
I'm sorry, I missed it.
And some of these ultimate values that you were talking about, based on the irrational in man.
Yes, this is the claim, and certainly in some sense ultimate values are based on the irrational in the sense of man's need and so on. But the point would be, can he give a rational justification for certain policies of satisfying his needs? Or is it the case that the policies, the value judgments, are themselves irrational, in the sense of you cannot prove one to the other? And there I'm not sure that, as a matter of fact, man's values derive from his needs, and his needs are what they are. They're neither, in a sense, they're not. Or non-murdering for satisfying these needs. Another person says, I have these policies, let's say headhunting or ritual murder or something else for satisfying these policies. Can rationality begin to work there? Can one say, these are right ways of satisfying these needs and these are wrong ways? Or is it a question, this too is irrational? Here, as I've tried to suggest, I'm not sure. On the one hand, it seems to me the evidence that there is no way of proving it, and therefore it depends upon arbitrary ultimate commitment, is strong. And yet, perhaps this is just my own conventionalism, I wonder if there isn't given some degree of recognition that human beings have shared needs, that they try to talk, that they're open to argument, some way of proving, justifying value judgments more objectively. Yes? You have to speak just a little louder.
It seems to me that you're sort of lumping all human beings into the same category, whereas I would think that there are individuals who operate upon by means of their intellect and who could be swung by scientific theories rationally, and there are others who operate solely on emotion, and to whom one single emotional experience could outweigh 1,000 theories. He will pay Jews because one Jew once cheated him.
Yes, now let's see how one could answer that. You're certainly right. The question is, what are we doing here? Let's see if I can give an illustration. Let me view it this way. A person does mathematics. In mathematics, he proves a theorem. Let's make a simple one, and then let's make a hard one. The hard one we won't say. We'll just give it a name. The simple one will say 2 + 2 is 4. That actually isn't so simple, but let's assume to prove he proves 2 and 2 is 4. The hard one we'll say is Gödel's theorem. Now, you come to the average kid in class, and it turns out that everybody, let's say, can do 2 and 2 is 4. That, of course, isn't true. Mentally retarded children can't, and so on. But everybody, let's say, can do 2 and 2 is 4. But it turns out that not even 1 in 100, that approximately 1 in 20,000 can prove Gödel's theorem. Now, do you say, well, you see, some people have got it and some haven't? Or do you say, yes, but you see, the type of thing which a mathematical theorem is it's something which all people who learn mathematics can agree on if they follow the method. So in that sense, you lump all people together, even though, my God, there are lots of people, most of us can't do Gödel's theorem. I spent a year on it. I'm not sure whether I can or can't. I don't think I could by myself. I can with the help of a teacher. But as I don't think I certainly could never, but I vaguely can. I really couldn't say honestly that I can. But I'm not sure which side I am on. But most people can't. And if you make it one other thing, then I know I can't. So most people can't. So you then say, but this doesn't prove that the mathematical theorem depends on emotion or on genius. It's the sort of thing which can be proven true or false by rational men. Now, when I come to this question, Rembrandt is better than so-and-so, or symphony, you say, some people are tone deaf. Beethoven writes better music than Tin Pan Alley. You say, some people are tone deaf. Some people have only heard Tin Pan Alley. You can't prove it to them. Nonetheless, the question is this the sort of judgment that can be proven true or false to rational men? Just like the fact that most people can't do the Gödel theorem doesn't mean that it depends on emotion or on genius. It's the sort of judgment which can be proven true or false to rational men. Most people can't understand Einstein's theory. It's still the sort of judgment which can be proven true or false to all physicists, to all men who are willing to study. It isn't arbitrary. It doesn't depend on hurrah for Einstein or hurrah for Gödel. Now, is ethics that sort of thing? The sort of thing which can be proven true or false to rational men? Or is it something else which can't be proven? And I was suggesting that, on the one hand, most of the arguments we suggested led that it's ultimately arbitrary. It can't be proven true or false. On the other hand, I'm not sure. The fact that some people won't learn it is no different. Some people won't learn mathematics. Some people won't learn 2 and 2 is 4. The question is it the sort of inquiry which rational men, if they pursued, could arrive at truth in? And here I'm not sure, because it seems to me to the extent to which value judgments hinge upon fact, to the extent to which there's convergence in aesthetic judgment, to that extent, I think I showed something about the possibility, if men grant certain rationality, certain openness to evidence, of saying value judgments are also things which we can talk about and which we can prove. But if we're wrong, then it seems to me there are 2 things. One thing is we could say nihilism. Since you can't prove value judgments, well, anyone is as good as any other. And that's been one of the tendencies in 20th century thought. Since you can't prove value judgments, anyone is as good as any other. But actually all that follows is, since you can't prove value judgments, since they depend upon your ultimate commitments, you have to be as clear and self-conscious as possible in making your ultimate commitments, and you must be willing to stand for them, knowing that they are incapable of proof. with the tolerance that comes from knowing your judgments are incapable of proof, and I suppose with the degree of commitment that comes from knowing you must make a stand somewhere, even though you can't give an ultimate proof. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.